Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Pause for Pedagogy, a conversation with Cam Beatty. My name is Lisa Endersby, and I'm an educational developer at York University in Toronto, Canada, and co-editor of Pause for Pedagogy. The ILA and I are thrilled to welcome Cam to our latest conversation in the Pause for Pedagogy series. Welcome, Cam. Happy to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me. Excited to engage with you.
Thank you. So I'd love if you could begin our conversation by sharing a little bit about yourself for the folks at home.
Yeah, so I currently live in Tallahassee, Florida. I'm working at Florida State University in our undergraduate leadership studies program and our graduate program in higher education here. We have a leadership learning research center, which I also get to play with some wonderful colleagues and engage in leadership education research here at Florida State. Born and raised in Indianapolis, Indiana, go Hoosiers. And I did my graduate work at Indiana University and my PhD at Iowa State University in higher education administration.
So you are currently probably having the opposite of weather that we are having in Toronto currently. When was the last time you saw some snow?
I moved here from Boston last year.
Okay.
And I'm actually going there this weekend for a conference, and I see.
So you're going to ACPA?
I am going to ACPA.
Awesome.
So I'm a little annoyed about the snow because I went to escape it. But I was born and raised in it, used to the cold. So it's been really nice to say, oh, it's February and it's 75 degrees, but I'm not rubbing that in at all.
I mean, you're allowed to just a little. Us Canadians are a tough and hardy breed. We're used to it. That's awesome. Thanks, Cam. So let's talk about your article. What key question or questions were you hoping to answer in writing this article for us?
Well, the first one for me was really for us as leadership educators, really thinking about how can we be more creative when thinking about the type of assignments that we create, when we think about the course design, when we think about learning outcomes. I think we can get a little more critical and a little more deep, and it doesn't have to be in a 5 to 7 page paper, right? So for me, I wanted to offer an assignment that is outside of the regular things that we think about when we think about leadership education or how we measure a student's learning or growth throughout the semester. And I thought this was a wonderful opportunity to at least engage in conversation or dialogue about what different assignments can look like.
Right, absolutely. And I love that you're talking about depth. I know that a lot of our colleagues who read Pause for Pedagogy or engage with ILA are always so interested in the depth that we can take our students to in thinking about leadership and their own identity as leaders, which I think for me really came out for you when you were talking about this podcast for change assignment. So my next question is really more about this assignment in particular. So if you could tell us more about the podcast for change assignment, and where did the idea for this pedagogy come from?
Yeah, so I am a lover of podcasts. I love like Code Switch and Hidden Brain, but I also love just like the social, like the pop culture types of podcasts. So I'm a lover of all things podcasts. And before, like this is after the assignment, I now have my own podcast. So it's called Scholar T, for those of you that are interested in exploring that. But for this particular assignment, I was interested in I taught this for the course that this was for. Is for Leadership in a Diverse Society was the name of the course, and I taught it in a traditional format. You know, we met twice a week, hour and 15 minutes, and the final assignment was always this kind of paper assignment. And for this particular course, this was in Sweden, and I only had 4 weeks with the students. We met every day for the for Monday through Friday for the 4 weeks. But I didn't want the students to walk away and just write a paper, right? I wanted to really think about this, and I saw in a higher ed course that someone had their students doing podcasts. I was like, oh, well, what would this look like abroad for students to work in a group collaboratively and think about their learning and be able to offer that and share that with others. So that's kind of where the idea for the assignment came about.
That's really cool. And I love that you're thinking about it from a collaborative standpoint too, and this idea that podcasting or reflecting writ large can feel like a really solitary act sometimes, which is kind of counter to how we often think about leadership. So it sounds like this was really meant to be an opportunity for students not to just engage with your content, but to engage with each other as well.
Yeah, because we spend so much time when you are abroad, you do spend, for the way that this particular Global Leadership Study Abroad program was designed is these students spent a lot of time together, right? And they were learning together. We were learning in community with one another. So for me, it built on what we were already doing in the learning process as we were exploring Sweden, exploring Stockholm, exploring Scandinavia. The collaborative piece to me just made sense for how the trip was designed.
Absolutely. And so it sounds like outside of just getting students to collaborate or work with each other, that you had some really intentional learning outcomes for this assignment. So could you tell us more about what those learning outcomes were, and how did you assess whether these outcomes were met?
Yeah. So for me, it was students to not only think about how they come to understand leadership and define leadership, and leader, the difference between leadership and leader, but also thinking about the context of the country we were in, right? So what have you learned about this particular country? In this particular course, when we do it stateside, we look at some type of social movement and what leadership is happening through a social movement. So I wanted them to dig deeper in this particular country about what social issues or social movements are happening in this country, and what can we learn about leadership from these people or from these movements, and really having students dig a little deeper about making connections of bad leadership, but also some quote unquote good leadership, and having them make connections of how they show up as well in the leadership process.
Right. And so how did you grade or assess that? Were you giving them marks on how they collaborated or how they talked about leadership or leaders?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I did have a rubric. And for me, it was really well, number one, I always, whenever I do group assignments, I offer an opportunity for them to give each other feedback for the collaborative process. I think that's important because we say leadership is a process, but then we need to model then what that looks like. And I was just talking to someone earlier about this. It's thinking about feedback as love, right? So this is also an opportunity for them to model giving each other constructive feedback. So that's one assessment of the project. Also on the rubric, they had like 3 components that they had to address for finding leadership, finding someone to interview, and then outlining their social movement and giving context for what they're addressing. And then there was some technical stuff. So like how creative were they, right? Like some students love to do like intro music, name their segments and other things. So I wanted to give them some leeway to be creative and recognize that in the assessment of the grade as well.
That's awesome. And what a nice holistic picture. And I know that I'm taking away feedback as love, because I certainly don't always feel that way when I get feedback. I like that reframe. I like that reframe a lot, both giving and receiving as an act of love. That makes a lot of sense to me. That's a whole separate conversation, but I like that a lot.
And that's leadership too, right? Like I think
you're right. Yeah. Very cool. So obviously you've got big plans and you're going to ACPA, and I'm sure you'll get inspired there and maybe are already inspired to do other things. But where do you see future research or maybe writing headed in this area? What do you think you might be writing about next?
So I'm currently looking at specifically students and student activists currently on campus, and what they're learning about leadership and through the leadership process. And then if we can connect any of the undergraduate student leadership competencies to what students are learning through their engagement and activism on campus is one area that I'm looking at. My co-host for my podcast and I want to really delve into what is this understanding of public engagement, public intellectual. What do we learn from each other through engaging through podcasts, and specifically in a higher education context is one other area that's connected to the assignment that I'm interested in engaging with as well, moving forward as far as a research lens.
Cool. And I'm glad that you brought up the podcast. I really should have said, what are you podcasting about next? But I love that. That's cool to think about this public engagement of scholarship. Certainly something we're trying to do in our little corner over here in Positive Pedagogy. But I'd be really curious to hear your research into what that looks like, maybe on a broader scale, some learning outcomes attached to it. Sounds really cool.
Yeah, thank you.
You're very welcome. Is there anything else that you would like to share with us today?
No, I just want to challenge us, even for those of us that might not be in the classroom or facilitating learning. we might be facilitating workshops or facilitating trainings. And for me, it's like, how can we be more creative in doing that? And how can we think about different learning styles and learning approaches of how people come to understand leadership, or reframe leadership, or rethink their own leadership? And I think if we can be more engaging, more creative in doing that, I think the world is going to have much stronger leaders.
That's awesome. A challenge and a charge for our fellow ILA and higher education colleagues. Well, thank you so much, Kim. It was a pleasure to have you today.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It was really great engaging with you.
Thank you. So as everyone knows, Pause for Pedagogy is an initiative of the Leadership Education Member Interest Group of the International Leadership Association, ILA. Our articles and videos are available at www.ila-net.org, and you can also follow us on Twitter at @the_ILA. Thanks so much, everyone, and thanks again, Cam.
Thank you.